In June of 1777, Lieutenant General John Burgoyne led 7,200 professional soldiers south out of Canada, British regulars and Brunswick grenadiers, backed by artillery, river transport, and the full weight of the largest empire on Earth. Burgoyne expected to cut the American rebellion in half within the season. He wasn't being arrogant. By every conventional measure, he was right to expect it. What Burgoyne walked into instead wasn't just a military defeat. It was a deliberate weapon, one built not from steel or gunpowder, but from mercy. And it would do more damage to the British war effort than any battle that came before it. So how did a scrappier, half-starved American army, one that had spent the whole campaign losing, manage to defeat 6,000 British and German soldiers, not with a final, crushing blow, but by letting them keep their dignity? To understand why an act of mercy could function as a weapon, you have to understand how badly the year had gone for the Americans up to that point. In July 1777, Burgoyne's army had taken Fort Ticonderoga, a fortress the Americans considered nearly impregnable without a serious fight. The fort's fall was so sudden, so humiliating, that American General Arthur St. Clair was relieved of command and nearly court-martialed for abandoning it. Congress panicked. Morale up and down the northern colonies cracked. Meanwhile, the American plan depended on holding the Hudson River Corridor, the one geographic seam that, if Burgoyne controlled it, would sever New England from every other colony fighting the war. Cut that seam, and the rebellion doesn't just lose a battle, it loses the ability to function as one country. By late summer, the American Northern Army had been retreating for weeks. There was no reason, none, to expect that this collapsing, half-trained militia force could do anything to a professional European army except delay it. Here's the thing nobody tells you about surrenders in the 18th century. They were almost never dignified. Defeated armies were routinely stripped, marched past jeering enemy ranks, sometimes handed over their colors in ceremonies designed specifically to humiliate. A surrender was a weapon in itself, a tool for breaking the losing side's will to ever fight you again. Dignity was not the point. Submission was the point. That's the tactic Horatio Gates inherited when he took command of the American Northern Army in August 1777. And on paper, Gates was an unlikely person to reinvent it. He wasn't a battlefield tactician. He was a former British officer turned Continental Army administrator, a man better known for organizing supply lines and holding together a coalition of prickly militia colonels than for battlefield brilliance. He'd spent most of the two battles at Saratoga, Freeman's Farm on September 19th and Bemis Heights on October 7th, running the fight from headquarters, while subordinates like Benedict Arnold and Daniel Morgan did the actual fighting. So when the British Army, cut off, starving, and surrounded, finally opened surrender talks in mid-October, the obvious move, the traditional move, was to grind them down, humiliate them, make an example so severe that no British force would risk invading from Canada again. Gates didn't do that, and it wasn't naive, it was calculated. He understood something the traditionalists around him didn't. This surrender wasn't just happening on a field in upstate New York. It was happening in front of an audience 5,000 miles away, in Paris, where French ministers were watching closely to see whether this rebellion was a legitimate war between civilized nations or a chaotic colonial uprising not worth backing. A brutal, humiliating surrender would read as the latter. A negotiated, honorable one would read as the former. So instead of calling it a surrender at all, Gates called it something else entirely: a convention. A negotiated agreement between two legitimate militaries, not a conquest. Gates understood something conventional military thinking refused to accept: that the way you treat a beaten enemy can be worth more strategically than the beating itself. A crushed, humiliated army makes an enemy tell a story of atrocity. A respected, dignified one makes an enemy tell a story of legitimacy. And legitimacy was the one thing the American cause needed most, right at the moment France was deciding whether to bet its navy on it. Here's exactly how the tactic was built, piece by piece. First, the terms. The Convention of Saratoga, negotiated over several days in mid-October 1777, stated explicitly that Burgoyne's army was not surrendering unconditionally. Instead, his roughly 5,800 to 6,000 remaining British and German troops would march out of their positions with the honors of war, a specific, technical 18th century term. It meant they would keep their colors uncased, their drums beating, their muskets shouldered like soldiers on parade, not prisoners in disgrace. In exchange, they would lay down those muskets in an open field and pledge not to serve again in North America for the remainder of the war, after which they'd be shipped home to Britain. Second, the choreography of the ceremony itself. This is the part almost no popular account spends real time on, and it's the part that mattered most. Gates didn't just agree to let the British keep their dignity on paper, he engineered the physical scene to protect it. According to accounts passed down from officers present, Gates gave orders that his own troops should not gather to watch the stacking of arms ceremony and should not celebrate or jeer as it happened. Whether his exact wording survives in a single document is genuinely disputed by historians, but the effect described across multiple sources is consistent. American soldiers, by design, were kept largely out of the direct line of sight. The British and German troops marched out to lay down their arms without a crowd of enemies watching them do it. Third, the personal exchange between the two commanding generals, which set the tone for everything beneath it. When Burgoyne rode out to meet Gates in full dress uniform despite everything his army had just been through, he offered his sword, the traditional gesture of surrender. And according to accounts recorded by officers present, Burgoyne said something to the effect of, "The fortune of war has made me your prisoner." Gates's reported reply, he would always be ready to testify it was through no fault of Burgoyne's own generalship. Then Gates handed the sword straight back. That single gesture, take the sword, hand it back, is the entire tactic in miniature. It cost Gates nothing. It gave Burgoyne everything he needed to walk away from this disaster with his personal honor intact. And it meant that when Burgoyne eventually had to explain this catastrophe to Parliament, he could do it without also nursing a public grudge against the army that had beaten him. Fourth, the treatment of the German contingent specifically. Nearly half of Burgoyne's remaining force was made up of Brunswick and Hesse-Hanau troops under Baron Friedrich Adolf Riedesel, troops that had marched, fought, and starved through the entire campaign, alongside their commander's own wife and 3 young daughters, who'd traveled with the army the whole way. Baroness Friederike von Riedesel had spent the final days of the siege sheltering in a cellar with her children and a group of wounded officers, while American artillery fire continued outside. She'd personally helped nurse British General Simon Fraser as he lay dying after being shot during the fighting at Bemis Heights 10 days earlier, hit, by most accounts, by one of Daniel Morgan's riflemen, deliberately targeting mounted officers. Fraser had asked to be buried on high ground at sunset. By tradition, the burial went ahead, even as artillery still fired nearby, before both sides realized what was happening and the guns fell silent. That's the emotional temperature the surrender ceremony walked into, exhausted, grieving. And instead of being made to feel it in front of a jeering crowd, the defeated army was allowed to feel it in something closer to silence. Now cut to the man on the other side of that sword. John Burgoyne wasn't just any British general. Back home, they called him Gentleman Johnny, a nickname that was half admiration, half mockery. He was a playwright and a sitting member of Parliament as much as a soldier. A man who'd lobbied hard and openly in London for this command over officers with more seniority. He was known for traveling to war with the comforts of peacetime, a personal baggage train stocked, by reputation, with fine wine and provisions most campaign commanders would never have brought into hostile wilderness. It's the kind of detail his critics loved to repeat, whether or not every version of it is exactly accurate. That confidence wasn't baseless. Burgoyne had just taken Ticonderoga without a real fight. He commanded professional European regulars against what he genuinely believed was an undisciplined colonial rabble. Nothing in his experience told him that the force in front of him, a coalition of continental regulars and New England militia that had been retreating for most of the summer, could do anything except delay him a little longer before folding entirely. He never accounted for the possibility that the war might be won at this exact moment, not by muskets, but by the terms written into a surrender document. That wasn't a battlefield he knew how to fight on. October 17th, 1777. Cold enough for visible breath in the morning air. The British and German troops of Burgoyne's army formed up one final time. Not for battle, but for this. Drums beat a slow march. Colors, uncased, moved at the head of each column. Redcoats, worn and mud-stained after months in the field, next to the distinct blue of the Brunswick regiments, troops who'd marched further from home than almost anyone else in this war. They walked out across open farmland toward a single field designated for the ceremony. And the American army, by design, wasn't standing there to watch them do it. Muskets came down off shoulders. One by one, they were stacked, barrels crossed, bayonets catching the pale October light in neat, deliberate rows across the field. Officers who had commanded these men through Ticonderoga, through Freeman's Farm, through the brutal fighting at Bemis Heights, watched their soldiers lay down the tools of the only trade most of them had ever known. According to multiple later accounts, some of these soldiers, hardened professional troops, men who had marched thousands of miles from Europe and buried friends along the way, wept as they did it. Not from fear, from the particular grief of an ending that came without the usual cruelty attached to it. Then Burgoyne rode forward to meet Gates personally, offered his sword, received it back within moments. Neither man raised his voice. Neither man needed to. Every part of this had been built, deliberately, to happen exactly this way. Not because the Americans had gone soft after a hard-won fight, but because a report of this scene, dignified and restrained, was about to travel across an ocean and land on a desk in Paris, where it would matter more than almost anything else that happened in this entire campaign. Here are the numbers, and historians still go back and forth on the exact tallies. Burgoyne's surrendering force numbered somewhere between 5,800 and 6,000 British and German troops. The American army that had encircled him had swelled, with militia pouring in after the fall of Ticonderoga to somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 men, a 3-to-1 advantage at minimum that simply hadn't existed when the campaign began 4 months earlier. It's one of the largest single surrenders the British Army had suffered up to that point in its history. Not, by some counts, the largest ever, but large enough that London had no framework for absorbing the shock of it. An entire professional invasion force, gone in a single autumn morning, on a farm most of those soldiers had never heard of before that year. And none of it happened because the American side annihilated them. It happened because the American side let them walk away with something to hold on to. Saratoga reached Paris within weeks. Benjamin Franklin had been trying for over a year to convince French ministers that the American cause was worth the risk of open war with Britain. A dignified, negotiated surrender of an entire British army did something no battlefield victory alone could have done. It proved the Americans could not only fight a European power, but could conduct themselves like one. By February 1778, France signed a formal treaty of alliance. The war stopped being a colonial rebellion and became a global conflict Britain couldn't afford to win. There's a historical parallel worth holding up here. from a completely different war on a completely different continent. In 1808, at the Battle of Bailén in Spain, a Napoleonic French army under General Pierre Dupont surrendered to Spanish forces. The first time a Bonaparte army had gone down in the field, and a shock that helped convince the rest of Europe that Napoleon could be beaten. But the parallel breaks down in exactly the place that matters. Dupont's surrendered troops were treated brutally in captivity, with catastrophic mortality rates. No honors of war, no handshake. Saratoga's surrender worked as a diplomatic weapon precisely because Gates chose mercy where Bailén's victors chose punishment. And history remembers Saratoga as a turning point, while Bailén is remembered as an atrocity. The lesson underneath all of it travels well beyond 1777. How you treat the side you've just beaten can matter more strategically than the beating itself. Total victory that humiliates an enemy can cost you more in the long run than a controlled, dignified win that leaves the door open. For legitimacy, for alliances, for the story the rest of the world tells about who you are. As for the men in that field, the Convention Army, as it came to be known, the promise made to them didn't survive contact with Congress. Their passage home was delayed, then denied outright, and many spent years marched as prisoners between Massachusetts and Virginia. A number of the German troops eventually deserted and simply stayed in America. Today, the ground where they stacked their arms sits quiet inside Saratoga National Historical Park. There's a monument nearby with 4 statue niches for the campaign's key figures, and one of them, deliberately, has never been filled. If you're the kind of person who actually wants to know why history's biggest reversals happened, not just that they happened, we cover forgotten weapons and tactical decisions exactly like this one every week. Might be worth sticking around for the next one.